ready now. All right, then I will be starting my time now. We are in firm affirmation of the resolution. The U.S. federal government should require social media companies to pay news publishers for news content posted on the social media platforms. To start out with, we are defining news publisher as a reputable and factually backed news source. This is going to be extremely important for our case, so I'll say it again: a reputable and factually backed news source, something like the Washington Post or the New York Times, like a company that is for sure has factually backed evidence and is very reputable, not just like a random company that could be spewing lies and people wouldn't know. Our weighing mechanism is going to be cost benefit analysis. So now to move on to our plan, the mandate will be social media companies will pay news publishers in proportion to the traffic on the news publisher's page, as well as promoting these reputable news publishers' accounts. So I'll say that again in case you didn't get it. Social media companies will pay news publishers in proportion to traffic on the news publisher's page, as well as promoting these reputable news publishers' accounts. The agent of action will be the United States federal government, obviously, because they're the actor in the resolution. Our timeline will be by 2023, and our funding will just be the social media companies themselves. This will just come out of their pockets, which should not be a problem considering that social media companies make so much money. Our first contention is going to be accurate information. So in the status quo, as many people know, misinformation is extremely common on many social media sites just due to non-reputable sources or just random social media accounts spewing lies in the hope of either going viral or just any other strange motive that they have. But misinformation and just lies on social media and claims that have zero evidence to back them are extremely common, and they are extremely harmful. Look at just QAnon propaganda, for example, which has gained so much traction on social media, which has very minimal evidence to back it up, and no reputable news source has actually ever posted anything about that. So therefore, this information can be spread like wildfire to some very non-reputable accounts that have zero facts to back up their claims. The harms of this are very obvious. Just a misinformed public, which is very harmful, just because spreading false information can do terrible things, and just a lack of awareness about actual events happening in our world is also extremely harmful. If only misinformation is being promoted and spread on social media, and the actual harmful events that are happening in our world just are not being shared, then there will be a lack of awareness about these events, which will just lead to a lack of support and a lack of solutions to actually help this. In addition to this, another harm, which is constant misinformation, is just distrust with social media. People on social media oftentimes have to do a double take and figure out if something's actually truthful or not, because a large majority of the time, a lot of claims just are not true at all. So the solvency of our plan to solve for accurate information is that our plan incentivizes and promotes reputable news sources that actually post factual information. As we mentioned, sources such as the Washington Post, big reputable news sources that can't just lie because they are renowned and reputable, and they actually have evidence to back up their claims. So the overall impact of promoting and incentivizing these reputable news sources to post on social media is that we have a much more informed public. Misinformation isn't going viral, and people aren't spreading completely false information anymore. People are actually educated about certain events, and people are informed about what is truly going on in the world, based on facts. And in addition to this, there will be more awareness and support for actual world issues, because by incentivizing and promoting reputable news sources to share real, actual, factual information in the world, there will just be more support and awareness in the world for harmful events that are happening that need support, that are currently being overshadowed by false propaganda or just lies that go viral on social media. So now our second contention is that it's just mutually beneficial for both companies involved. In the status quo, news publishers have minimal incentive to post on social media due to a lack of financial compensation. So there is a kind of a lack of reputable news on social media, just because they are not being properly financially compensated, considering that these social media companies are not paying them to post information on their social media platforms. And in addition to this, older generations don't really look to social media to get news, because a lot of times it isn't truthful or reputable. They'd rather stick with a more traditional form of media, or an actual tangible newspaper. So therefore, social media platforms are missing out on like possible like members and more traffic on their platform. So as you can see, the harms of this is that both of these companies, the social media companies and the news publishers, are missing out on potential for more traffic and more members and more viewership, and therefore profit. Because considering that the news publishers are not receiving financial compensation for being on social media, they are kind of missing out on the social media audience, as well as missing out on money from social media companies. And these social media companies are missing out on like possibly older generations, or just more people that are looking to get like real, genuine, factually backed information from social media. So therefore, the solvency of our plan is that our plan incentivizes news publishers to post on social media due to the fact that they're now going to be receiving proper financial compensation for posting like legitimate information on social media. And in addition to this, our plan also brings more people, specifically like older generations and just people that are looking to get factual information from social media to these platforms. So therefore, there are more people on like reputable news publishers page because of the social media audience. And in addition to this, there are more people on the social media platform because there's the new audience of people looking to get their news on social media. And obviously this helps both companies financially. So the overall impact of this contention was just that more financial success for both of these companies could lead to the growth of both of these industries and both of these like big like corporate powers. So just like this would lead to more jobs, which would overall lead to economic growth. And the benefits of economic growth are kind of just obvious, just a higher quality of life for everybody. So for all of these reasons and more, we are in firm affirmation of the resolution.
All right, hello everyone. I'm going to be the leader of the opposition. I'll just give a quick introduction before my speech. My name is Amelia Tisdale. My pronouns are going to be they, them. I know on tab it says she, her. I can't have my pronouns on tab for family issues, but I think you understand that. So with that out of the way, if I'm ever talking too fast or anything's not clear, feel free to let me know. Perfectly okay with that. Quick off-time roadmap. I believe I'm going to go onto the opposition's case first, and then I'll go into the government case. With that, and I'm probably going to cross-apply like some of our contentions from our case as refutations for the gov case. But if I go off of that off-time roadmap, I'll make sure to signpost so that it's still clear. With that out of the way, I will begin my time now. So hello, judges. We are debating again under the resolution that the United States federal government should require social media companies to pay news publishers for news content posted on the social media platforms. So onto the definitions for the round. They define the criterion or the weighing mechanism of this round as a cost-benefit analysis. We agree to this definition of the criterion. Onto their definition for news publication. We believe that this definition is a little bit like faulty, so I'm going to provide a little bit of a different definition because I think it closes the scope of the debate round. We're specifically finding fault with the fact that they say it has to be reputable and factually backed news sources. Which simply is not the definition of a news publication. A news publication or a news proprietor is specifically a newspaper publisher or a business firm that publishes newspaper. That's just simply the definition of a news publication and has nothing to do with whether or not it's reputable or factually backed. Specifically, additionally, with the idea that like there's no way to measure whether it's reputable or factually backed. So that closes the scope of the debate round. But even if you don't buy that our definition is a better definition than the one provided by the government, we still can operate under the definition provided by the gov, specifically in the scope of their plan, and their plan is to pay in proportion to the traffic on the page as well as promote news publishers. So with that out of the way, I'm going to be getting into the op case to show exactly how the contentions and the uniquenesses provided by the government do not flow through. On our first idea that we're going to be providing as the opposition, we're going to be showing how by making social media companies pay news for news content posted, it's going to ultimately lead to the proliferation of fake news. Essentially, if companies decide not to have to pay, actually, before I get into that, sorry, I'm going to provide a little bit of background information for this resolution. So currently, the reason why we are debating this resolution is in Australia right now, there's a debate going on within the government whether or not social media companies like Google and Facebook specifically are the ones that this resolution is surrounding around. Social media companies like Google and Facebook have to pay their news sources. It's typically it's currently battling with 7 different news sources, and that's what this is about. Is it's happening in Australia in the current status quo, and the idea is that they're going to have to pay, obviously, social media companies for their media. So with that out of the way, we're going to get into the idea of the proliferation of fake news. So if these companies decide not to pay these news organizations, what happens is that on these social media platforms, there no longer is reputable news sources. So let's say that the social media company, Google, for example, does not want to pay the Washington Post because it would be a hefty fee to put their news on their website. There no longer would be that access to reputable news on the social media website. It's not like just because like Google wants to not pay, they'll still put it on, because the Washington Post will not want to have their news on the social media platform if they're not paying for it. That means that there will be a loss of like reputable news sources. If like social media companies have like with the real news on the website, the door is completely open for news to be able to spread. The social media companies have a greater incentive to keep the fake news up than to have the real news up, because they don't have to pay for the fake news. All the social media companies really care for on the bottom line is to make profit. That's, I think, what both sides agree on, is both like the social media companies and the news companies, bottom line is they want to make profit. The only way that these social media companies are going to be making a profit and not have to pay a fee is if they're like not having to pay for the real news. That opens the door for fake news to come in and completely sweep it out. Under the AF plan, Google also can't pay for an algorithm to suppress news in order to pay less, meaning that if they open up this door and close the door on the real news, that like fake news will be able to come in. Additionally, according to the Digital Rights Watch, Facebook and Google are currently being debated in Australia to be obligated to pay the news corporations. Facebook and Google under the AF's plan would be obligated to have to pay for these news corporations. But on the other hand, the news corporations do not have any incentive to have to spend that money to improve their news. So they're going to be getting this extra source of revenue from these social media companies, but all that's going to be doing is you're not going to see an impact out on the consumer and the consumer of the media. You're going to be seeing that money go straight into the pocket of the CEO of the news company. It's not going to improve the type of news, which is like what the affirmation is trying to portray in their first contention, the idea of accurate information, about how this will stop information. It's actually going to spread the proliferation of fake news. Again, because these social media companies have no incentive to keep the real news on. If the consumer can't determine which is a real reputable news source and which one is not, simply just by name, and that like when you look up on Google News, there only will be like the lack of like the reputable news sources, that would equal out to the proliferation of fake news, specifically additionally under their definition of news publications. The second idea that we're going to be bringing up is about the squashing of local media survival. Essentially, it's going to cut out any small media companies from being able to survive, because these major media companies are not the only reputable sources. We can see a lot of like smaller news publications specifically are really beneficial and are really necessary, specifically for like political and democratic elections. People need to have local news sources and smaller like local media survival to be able to get access to their local small elections. Like if you're doing a local small mayoral election, CNBC is not going to be covering like the local election of my small town. That's just not something that they have an incentive to do. They will be covering major elections, but you will be seeing a decrease in like a watch of like local small elections, which you're ultimately going to be seeing a decrease in like incentive for the local representatives, which I'll get into a little bit later in my case. Additionally, the government only cares about national media corporations because those are the ones that they fund, meaning that the only ones that would be able to afford this, and the only media companies that would be able to afford this, like paying for the news, would be the larger corporations. So what you're going to be seeing is a squeeze from smaller companies, and they're essentially going to be dying out. What you're going to be seeing is a one or the other kind of partisanship where you're only going to get a couple aspects of news. You're not going to get the well-rounded, vetted like source of news that you need. Like I think most people agree you shouldn't just only be able to look at one news source and take that as a fact. You kind of have to look at multiple perspectives. But if we're making it so that you have to pay for every single aspect of news that is on social media, there only will be a couple perspectives. Because again, these social media companies have to pay for the news, but they have a finite amount of resources. They can't pay for every single news publication to be able to put their information on their websites or on their social media platforms, meaning that there's going to be a squeeze on the amount of like news that is out on those platforms, and it's going to be closing the amount of perspectives that you get, which ultimately is going to be harming the proliferation of fake news. It's going to be increasing fake news, but it's also going to be decreasing like the spread of ideas and different like perspectives. But B, it's going to be crushing small local media survival. They're not going to be able to get like their word out there. So moving on into the government's case, their first ideas on this idea of like accurate information and about how like misinformations and lies on social media are bad. First of all, the majority of misinformation and lies spread on social media are not from news publication sources, but are from individuals themselves. Like a lot of the debates that we're surrounding false information typically stem from like Donald Trump posting something on Twitter. The majority of false information isn't from media companies, it's from individuals. This wouldn't be stopping that spread of false information because that has nothing to do with that scope of the debate. Additionally, if they're saying that their idea under their definition of news publications is reputable and factually backed news sources, that wouldn't be squashing out misinformation. Specifically, if they're only paying for reputable news sources, again, that wouldn't be squashing out misinformation because those smaller, non-reputable social or news platforms still are able to have their news on the social media platforms. Those aren't squashed out. They're still there. So you still have the false information, but you're literally just squashing the amount of perspectives that you get on this idea. Onto their second idea about how it's mutually beneficial and that both miss out on a profit. Like if you look up on Google CNN, it's like CNN, and you go onto the CNN website, they get ad revenue. So it's not like these news companies aren't getting any money for having like Google have their news website on there. Like it's not like they're missing out on profits, and it's not like they're taking a large cut. So this idea that it's mutually beneficial just doesn't flow through, and it does not lead to more jobs and economic growth. So they cannot access those impacts for that. So for all of these reasons about how it honestly just spreads the proliferation of fake news, squeezes out ideas, and squashes out smaller local media companies, I strongly negate the resolution and urge an opposition ballot.
Alrighty, are my opponents ready?
Yeah.
And are my judges ready?
Yep.
Then I will start my time now. We stand in firm affirmation of the resolution that the U.S. federal government should require social media companies to pay news publishers for the news content they post on social media platforms. I'll start by going over the neg case or the op case, and then going over the affirmations case. So starting first and foremost with our definitions, we had a slight point of contention here, and here's why you have to prefer the Gov's definition provided. So quick resolutional analysis here. For any substantial change for the affirmations, like if the aff passes, any substantial change will come from these major reputable news sources. Things like CNN, the Washington Post, and like Reuters, things that are reputable and well regarded are going to have the most significant impact on the social media platforms. And even if you take the the negations definition, you're really not going to see that much change. And negation even concedes that our definition is more inclusive and they can work underneath our definition. And it just provides the most grounds for this debate. Additionally, even if you prefer their definition, the only significant changes are going to come from these large reputable news sources. So you just have to prefer ours anyway, simply because it's just naturally what's going to occur if you just include all news sources, because they're just so prominent and such big staples in the news industry that they're really only going to be making the majority of the impacts in this case. Going on to the first contention of fake news, my opponents state that since social media companies are unwilling to pay, basically there's no incentive for them to basically pay these news companies because like they don't have an incentive and they can just promote misinformation. However, this is not true, and this is why we mandated our plan in the way that we did. We do it based on traffic for the social media or for the news publisher's page, and the way social media companies make money is through advertisement based off the traffic to the news publisher's page. The social media company can accurately gauge how much they can be paying them, and they're not going to be at a loss for paying these news companies, because by nature of clicking onto the news company's page and receiving those advertisements, it in itself is mutually beneficial and pays for the additional costs. And even if so, the additional costs are so tiny and marginal that really the overall benefits outweigh the costs to like the minor inconvenience of the social media company. So just by the way our plan works, we help offset that cost and promote actual real information instead of the misinformation that is so prolific in the status quo right now. The neg provides no solvency for the current issues at hand, while the affirmation actually promotes and increases that concentration of real factual information. Now going on to their second contention of squashing local media and how it's really only going to cover large-scale events and small local media companies are going to die out. And this is just not true, because these are non-rival goods. The consumption of large media does not prohibit the consumption of small media. You can turn on national CNN and then also get local coverage on another station. Just simply saying that you're going to promote larger reputable social media companies really doesn't stop or prohibit other companies from like functioning well. And the social media, as for the smaller social media companies that will get squashed out by this bill that we're passing into law, again, through our plan based on traffic on the website, it's going to be proportional to the size of the social media company. If there is a smaller social media company that less people use, then there is going to be less traffic on that website, and they will not have to pay the same amount of money as large conglomerates like Instagram and Facebook. A smaller social media company is not affected or hurt by this law only because, or by this plan, simply because it's based on the viewership and based off the traffic that that news source can actually provide. So this contention that squashing local media will happen doesn't really flow through, one, because our plan mandates it, so it's based off traffic, and there's still going to be a proportional amount of fees for each local or for each social media company. And additionally, the fact that news by itself is a non-rival good kind of negates this contention, so you can cross it from the flow. Going on to the affirmation case, there is no issue with our framework. We also agree on, like, there's no issue with our counter plan or weighing mechanism. So going on to our first contention of misinformation, my opponents state that this large sum of misinformation that is on social media companies as of now is based at an individual level. And that may be true, but their organizations still contribute to this. Basically, misinformation can come from non-reputable news sources, and our plan actually just increases and incentivizes more. Like, if you look at it at a percentage wise, there is going to be a larger percentage of accurate news with more traffic because we're promoting those companies. Underneath our plan, the social media companies and the news publishers are promoted, and they're actually incentivized to post accurate information underneath the negation world where they're advocating for the status quo. And we see these harms that they don't solve for. Basically, overall, underneath our plan, major news companies who already have that stigma around them to be reputable are going to be, they're going to be more prolific, and their actual accurate information is going to have a larger impact than a lot of this misinformation, and it can help offset that negative harm, which the negation doesn't do. Now, going on to our second contention, that it is mutual benefit. Again, going over our plan, we do it based on traffic, and you're not going to be paying large sums of money for some minor social media companies or a minor news publisher. If my partner and I wanted to start a small news publication, we are not going to get any traffic, and we don't have the actual resources to create a large firm or a large news company. So we're not going to actually be a substantial cost for that social media company. And the ones that will be a substantial cost will also bring in massive advertisement and traffic revenue simply by their page existing. You can put advertisements in those social media. That is how foundationally they make their money. And if you're promoting these pages, then you're going to see more ad revenue from those pages, and it's going to offset that cost and increase your demographic that you're reaching. As my partner mentioned before, that they didn't really mention or respond to, so it flows through. The older generations who have a general distrust for the misinformation on social media companies will actually be drawn to social media companies, and they're widening their consumer base simply because you're actually having more reputable information and more people willing to actually give it a chance, rather than just watching the typical news. So, since it is more accessible, both sides benefit from this, and therefore our plan has to flow through because, one, we're reducing misinformation and it doesn't harm individual companies. So overall, the AF wins on almost every single one of these issues: fake news and squashing local media. And you have to prefer our definition because it is the natural course in our case, works underneath both. And since there are no small social media companies, won't make a difference. So for those reasons and more, please vote for the Gov.
Okay, I'm going to go into a brief off-time roadmap. Like my partner said, if you need me to slow or clear, just yell them out loud. POIs, again, just unmute. With that, my order of speaking, brief off-time roadmap, I'm going to go over top of case. I'm only going to spend like 30 seconds there. Then I'm going to go into my partner and I's case, make some clarifications there. And a lot of that will be able to cross-apply, but I will be spending about the last half of my speech on my opponent's cases, my opponent's contentions. With that, my time will begin now. Hello, everyone. My name is Melina Bloom. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm going to the second speaker on the negation or the opposition today for Valencia High School. With that, I'm going to go over definition. We don't want this to be a definitional debate. I apologize if it came off that way. My partner simply provided a news that my partner and I are going to be operating under because we believe small news sources that aren't necessarily considered reputable because they're not national news media should be considered news. But we believe that under the plan you guys are doing, you're only going to be doing things that the government or the social media company has vetted as reliable. That's just, we wanted to make clear that the dictionary definition can be separate from the plan definition. And under the plan, we'll be operating under there. No reason to drop anyone here. We just wanted to make that clarification so that we can make our plan make more sense. With that, I'm going to go into my partner and I's case. Our first contention is that on the proliferation of fake news. Now, there's a couple reasons this can happen. A, companies might not just want to pay. The end of the day, there's a really symbiotic relationship between news companies and social media companies. We all agree there. That's the reason this is a debate. But at the end of the day, news companies need social media more than social media needs news companies. Because news companies can only really advertise through social media anymore, through Google, through Facebook. But Facebook and Google have a ton of other advertisers that they're working for. Why does this matter? Essentially, my opponents say that their plan is based off traffic, based on that the news source brings to the social media company. So social media companies will immediately make up that cost and they'll want to pay it. Here we see an underestimating and a lot of conjecture. Although that it might seem like a logical train of thought, I'm going to bring up a historical example. I say historical, it happened earlier this year, that can really show you that social media companies do not need the news and they will not pay if they don't want to. My partner brought up, we brought up the background that went conceded, like we agree that this is happening because of Australia and plans specifically regarding Google and Facebook in Australia. When that plan was announced by the Australian Parliament, they're like, hey, we're working on this. You guys are going to have to pay news sources. Facebook conducted the largest content shutdown they have ever done, shutting down everything that looked like news, even if it wasn't, simply because they wanted to make a point to the Australian government. They shut down millions of posts that were bringing revenue to Facebook because they did not want to pay this fee. Facebook does not need the news and will not pay if it does not want to. We can see that they risk that loss to make a point to the Australian government that they are not paying that fee. We can see that although my opponents provide this conjecture that because social media makes money based on news sources, they're going to inherently be fine paying them, when that is simply a false conjecture, because Facebook has other forms of revenue. We can see this. We can see that they are willing to not take this plan. With that, we'd also like to talk about just some logistics that are impossible with my opponent's plan. Because this is, as per the resolution, the US federal government is the one deciding that the Facebook and the Googles and the Instagrams of the world are paying based on the amount of traction that the news websites are giving them. That's simply going to be very, very difficult for the government to enforce and very, very difficult to actually put in plan in the first place. Obviously, we assume fiat, but we can assume that there's going to be a decrease in the effectiveness of this plan just based on some logistics. We can assume it will go through because partly, but we cannot assume that it will be immediately 100% effective. Another thing about that plan. And then my opponents brought up that neg provides no solvency for fake news. We can talk, the negation here is not preventing a plan. However, we can prove that the AF will make the current status quo worse. That is our burden here. If companies decide not to pay because they don't want to, and we can see that they can fully make that decision with no effect to them, there will be no incentive to have real news on their social media platforms. If they can have 1,000 posts of fake news versus one thing that they had to pay for from CNN, they're going to take 1,000 things of fake news and assume the people on that website cannot tell the difference because they're still getting that money. Additionally, my opponents pretty much left this point untouched, but the Digital Rights Watch claims that Facebook and Google are not obligated to
pay, like the Facebook and Google might be obligated to pay under this plan. However, the news sources have no obligation to put that money back into journalism. Again, specifically pertaining to Australia, the people of Australia are supposed to assume that Rupert Murdoch is going to take these millions of dollars and put them into creating good journalism instead of his own pocket. That is not something that these media conglomerates are emphasized by. That's not what they want, and we have no evidence that their news is going to get any better. That is another way that we can see the affirmation is only making the status quo worse. And then we're going to talk about squashing local media and how important this is. My opponents brought up that the consumption of large media does not necessarily mean that people aren't consuming small media. However, they are direct competitors. You only have 24 hours in a day to consume media. You can either consume CNN or you can consume, we're in Santa Clarita, our local newspaper is The Signal. You can't do both at the same time. So at the end of the day, when you are promoting only big corporations and the government is only allowing them to get paid because those are the only reputable sources, you're not going to see, local media will get squashed in the process. That's what's happening now under the status quo, and the affirmation is only going to worsen this process. Local media is important, and we tend to ignore it. For example, in Norway and Japan, which are more abundant, they have a more abundant local news culture than we do. The places where they have the most abundant local news are the most efficient and engaged in local elections. Or local candidates, local Congress people in areas that have local news are more likely to stick by the wishes of their people. Historically, if you are a candidate in a place that doesn't have local news and therefore no pushback against what you are doing in your governmental position, you are more likely to rebel against what people voted you in for. So we can see that by encouraging the consumption of large media corporations and only large media corporations, you are inherently silencing local news networks that are so important to American democracy. With that, I'm going to go into my opponent's case. Essentially, their first contention is on accurate news. Here you can cross-apply our first contention in a lot of ways. A, that misinformation is only going to spread further if social media companies don't want to pay for real news. Social media, essentially, yeah, that's the biggest thing here. Social media companies have no reason to pay for the real news if they don't need it. And then we're going to go into, additionally, it's going to make news less accessible. You're decreasing the quantity and therefore decreasing the amount you see. If you're seeing 8 resources from CNN instead of 8 from your local news, because most people click on the first thing they see. Again. Then we're going to talk about mistrust in social media. Essentially, this talks about how older populations are going to more trust social media because it's inherently more trustworthy when they're paying smaller corporations, which there's a couple fallacies here. A, because a lot of people will assume that if you're being paid to do something, you're going to be less trustworthy. But that's besides the point. It also misunderstands the purpose and the symbiosis of social media. Social media is necessary for news companies because news companies need that advertising. The only way to get onto CNN is to Google it. The Google needs social media companies because that process of searching for CNN gets that money to Google. However, we can see that once you are on this website, once you are on that social media page, all the advertisements there go directly to the media base. They are getting paid here. And that incentive to post on social media comes from the attention you get, not from the direct cash compensation. No one else is directly paid in cash. Why should we start now? With that, you can see that that plan also falls through, and there's not going to be inherently any more trust in social media companies. In fact, you will only make it worse by deepening the pockets of major media corporations. With that, I strongly urge a negative ballot.
Okay, hello, I'm going to be back for my final speech. I'm just going to be going over some key voter issues and kind of condensing down the round to make it easy to digest and judge. So if everybody is all ready to go, sorry, let me get my paper set up. If everybody's all jazzy, then I will begin my time now. Hello, Judge. So what I'm going to do in this speech is I'm essentially going to condense down the AF world and the neg world, what you get with each plan. So first, in the AF world, what are you getting under their plan? Well, in the AF world, what you're doing is you're getting an increase in fake news and a decrease in real news. The warrant that we provide for this is specifically what is happening currently in Australia right now, what happened with Facebook. We can tell in the AF provides no warrant to prove why Facebook or any of these other social media companies would accept accept this fee. Whereas we negate show multiple warrants about how these social media companies will not take this fee. What happened in Australia about how Facebook was really petty and just shut down all news on their website for 5 days shows that these social media companies are not willing to pay these fees. It does not matter. Like we said, the social media companies are not reliant on the news source for all of their revenue, whereas the news sources are reliant on social media for their revenue. There is no incentive for these social media companies to accept this plan. There's no reason for them to keep this real news on their website, meaning, and through our first contention, that this will equal a proliferation of fake news. Because you're squeezing out these these social media companies are not going to be putting on these larger news sources because they simply do not care to pay. What you're going to be getting left on these websites is these smaller media companies who might not be as reputable. And that's the main point that our opponents are trying to make, is to get rid of a lack of like reputable news sources. But what they're doing is they're causing that exact same thing that they're saying they're trying to prevent. They're increasing fake news and decreasing real news. And again, we provide this Australia warrant to show real world examples of how this is going to happen. Again, the AF provides no warrant for this, so you as the judges have no reason to believe that this would happen. The second thing that's going to be happening in the AF world is a decrease in local democracy. Like we showed in our second contention about the idea of squashing local media survival, in places like Norway and Japan, where there is more abundant news culture, there are more effective and local engaged elections. In the in places where there is not as much like local news coverage, specifically on local small elections, the people running in these elections do not have as much of an incentive to do what the people ask them, because there's not as much of an accountability. If you don't have news covering these people, they have no reason to go on their claims, because going to know if they're not going through on their claims. They won't know. So again, we bring that warrant about how it's going to show a decrease in local democracy. The last thing that you're going to be getting in the AF world is a news squeeze, a shutout of smaller news companies and news sources. Again, because local media survival is dependent on, like these media companies are dependent on these social media companies to get their word out. And if the social media companies refuse to show them, you're going to be getting a squeeze of news. You're only going to be getting whatever the social media companies want to pay for. You're going to be getting a closing of perspectives and of news perspectives instead of having like a wide variety of ideas. So now what are you going to be getting in the Gov plan or the neg world? Under the neg world, you're still going to be getting a wider perspective of news, because we are not going to be shutting it out. We are just sticking with the status quo. And I want to emphasize the fact that the status quo has no harms. The only benefits that we could possibly see in the AF world, a little bit more money in the pocket of the news corporations, which ultimately just goes to the CEO. Proven also how that will not benefit like the quality of the news. It literally, the only benefit of the affirmations world is to put more money in the pocket of the news companies. In the neg world, we are not seeing any harms to the people. Under the status quo, there is no harms, any unique harms. Under the status quo, there's no unique harms to both the people, to the news corporations, or to the social media companies. We should just stick with the symbiotic relationship that we're having where both benefit. Like again, the news companies are still getting ad revenue on their websites. If you go onto CNN, there will be ads on the side. Through those ads, CNN making money. It's not like without this deal, CNN's going to fall apart and they're never going to make money again. They still are able to survive. So again, under the AF world, you're getting an increase in fake news and a decrease in real news. We provided our Australia warrant. And in the AF world, you're getting a decrease in local democracy and accountability. We provided our Japan and Norway warrants. And again, you get a news squeeze where you're getting a shutout of smaller perspectives. In the neg world, you're not getting any harms whatsoever. If you maintain the status quo, nothing happens. So for all of those reasons, Judge, I strongly urge an opposition ballot, and I strongly negate the resolution.
Okay, if everyone is ready, I'm going to be starting my time now. Okay, so for the final time, we are in firm affirmation of the resolution. The U.S. federal government should require social media companies to pay news publishers for news content posted on the social media platforms. For my voters, I'm just going to be kind of going over like the layout of our plan again and why it does flow through and why it is solvent, and then kind of weighing our impacts and explaining why we win this round on the impacts. So to start out with, for our plan, our opponents claim that social media companies just will not pay for these large reputable news sources, so our plan won't succeed because these social media companies are only driven by like this cost that they would have to pay. However, as my partner has mentioned multiple times, the cost of social media companies just is not nearly as detrimental as my opponents are claiming, just due to the fact that these social media companies are paying in proportion to the traffic that they receive onto their page. So therefore, they're not going to be paying a huge fee every single time. They're paying in proportion to the traffic that they receive. So therefore, if the social media companies like do have to pay a large fee, they're also getting a ton of traffic and ad revenue in return. So therefore, they're not really losing any money. If they have to pay a news publisher a bunch of money to like post news, to post news, then in return, they are going to be getting revenue from traffic and ads. So therefore, this costs and this idea that social media companies would face like a huge financial detriment just is not true because of the things they would receive in return for promoting this news publisher. And it's mutually beneficial for both the news publisher and the social media company to engage in this sort of promotion because it brings more traffic to the social media platform, as I just mentioned, and the news publisher obviously gains money. And it fixes the harm of the status quo, despite my opponent saying that there are no harms in the status quo and in the neg world. There definitely are. It fixes the harm in the status quo that misinformation misinformation constantly being promoted by like a viral post or something. And instead, this is fixed by promoting reputable sources instead, rather than continuing to allow this culture where like random lies go viral every single day. These social media platforms would be promoting reputable sources. And the reason they would be promoting these reputable sources is because it would be a mutually beneficial business deal, as I just mentioned. So now to move on to our impacts and why our impacts do flow through. Our most important impact is the one from our first contention, which is about accurate information and just like having a more informed and trusting public. So like by promoting reputable news sources, which as I've mentioned is mutually beneficial for both the social media platforms and the news sources, because the news sources are being paid and the social media platforms have much more traffic, which leads to much more ad revenue. Like legitimate information is being spread, which helps the public become informed about real world events and how they can get involved and like support real world issues rather than just having false information going viral every day and just like spreading lies, which does not really help to solve any world issues. And then our second impact for our second contention was like more financial success within the social media and reputable news companies. It could lead to more jobs and economic growth. And my opponents kind of mentioned that this would not really be existent. Like news companies already get ad revenue, and like this economic growth would like barely exist. Yeah, I mean, this impact would be minimal, but it still exists to some degree. Just due to the fact that these social media companies are providing more incentive and more revenue for these news publishers to post information. And the cost for social media companies is paid off from the traffic and ad revenue that they gain from promoting news content. So obviously, due to this mutually beneficial business deal, there is more revenue coming in. And the degree to which the economy grows probably will not be very large. So that's why I feel like my first impact is more important. However, this impact still exists and it should not be completely scratched from the flow. So yeah, for these reasons and more, we are in firm affirmation of the resolution.
Good round, you guys.
Yeah, thank you. That was a good round.
Good job.
All right, I think we have a decision. Please, Michael, if you would like to go first.
Sure. So I think that that Neg did well to challenge AF's definitions. There was nothing intuitive about the definitions that AF proposed. So I think they were right to challenge them. And in particular, point out that there's really no way to judge what news sources are reputable. And I didn't hear an answer to that. So I think that they got an edge on the definitions, not the major point of the round, but I still think that AF should have done more to counter Neg's argument on the definitions. Going to AF's second contention about the mutually beneficial result, I felt like this one didn't get fully explored. Neg pointed out that news publishers already get revenue from social media platforms. But I think the question that really didn't get debated was, if this is a better outcome and it's not prohibited now, why doesn't the status quo achieve this outcome on its own? Why is regulation necessary? Why does the federal government have to require this to happen if it's a mutually beneficial outcome and it's not prohibited currently? So this one I felt like didn't get fully engaged throughout the debate, and I judged it as sort of a wash. On AF's other main contention about reducing fake news and misinformation on social media platforms, I think it was a clear win for the neg. If reputable and factually based news sources cost money and other news sources are free, which are you going to get more of if you force social media platforms to pay for the reputable, factually based news? So in my mind, there's no question that AF's plan will lead to a proliferation of fake news, more misinformation on social media platforms. That is a harm. And I think that neg really carried the debate based on that. So I voted neg.
Great. I also voted neg. I think that I agree with Michael. I think that if you're going to define your affirmative and think about your strategy in this sense, the MG really needs to be prepared to defend it. I don't think there was much of a defense from the MG on that. And I think, to be honest, I mean, I tend to think like neg, just run a full theory shell and just nail them to the wall for it. I mean, you're clearly winning on case. I don't think you would have had a problem winning on theory. You probably would have gotten my vote pretty easily. I think that there's also just a problem with how the AF frames a lot of their arguments, right? A lot of these are framed, in a way in which, we can imagine these things happening in a vacuum, but you don't provide a lot of warranting or evidence as to why that might be true. You say that this will be mutually beneficial for both social media and for news publishers. You provide no argumentation to support that. At one point, at different points, the MG made the claim that there'll be an increase in older participation. Again, there was no Pew Research. Give me something that supports the directionality of a lot of your claims. I think some of the other arguments made by the MG as well did not help. You claim that these are non-rival goods, but ratings are a thing, and pulling in viewers are a thing. So I think that there was no strategy in terms of defending your AF plan, and I also would have liked to see a lot more warranting and killer LOR. Can I answer any questions? Great. Good job, y'all.
Thank you so much for judging.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Good luck in your next rounds.
Yeah, good luck to you guys.